today's lesson, we are going to be looking at imperial measurement. So we're going to be looking at the imperial measurement system, to be specific. And the reason we look at this is because it is one of the main two measurement systems. Now, normally in Canada, we go by the metric system. That's what most things are. However, we should know what the imperial system is only because it is primarily used by the United States. There are two other countries as well. I believe Myanmar is another, and I believe there is a third small country as well that also uses it. But because the United States uses the imperial system, a lot of that kind of bleeds over into Canada. And because the United States is such an influential figure in the global economy, in the globe, in the world itself, they tend to kind of push the imperial system on all the other countries. And a lot of the things that they use tend to be recorded in imperial measurement. So it is helpful to understand what the imperial measurement is and how to kind of just read it. So there are a couple YouTube videos that you can look at about the metric system and the imperial system. And you can look at what the different imperial measurements are. And we can see kind of a diagram here. We can see all of the different imperial measurements. Now on the left or on the right side, these are all metric. So we can see the metric system goes in a nice even order, equally spaced out or in proportion with each other. When you look at the imperial system, which is all the other units, you can see that it is quite diverse. It is all over the place. There's not necessarily a rhyme or reason, or there's probably a reason, but there's not really a common connection like we have in the metric system. And that's what makes the imperial system so kind of unique and also difficult to use, because there are many different measurements and there's not always a common conversion between them. And we'll look at conversions later. So we're just focusing on just imperial measurements right now. And we're going to focus on the main ones, which would be the inch, the foot, the yard, right? Those are kind of the main ones, even the mile. While all the other ones are technically part of the imperial system, these are the main ones that we will be looking at, and primarily focusing on inches and feet. So again, an introduction to the imperial measurement system. They are the two current measurement systems that we are using. The metric system, which we are most common with, tends to use basic units such as millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers. The imperial system, as we just kind of mentioned, smallest one that we kind of refer to as inches, then feet, then yards, and then miles. So those are kind of the comparisons or equivalent to the metric system. Now, there are some common abbreviations for when we're using the imperial units. So similar to how centimeters and millimeters have their abbreviations of cm and mm. Inch has an abbreviation of in, or it may have an abbreviation of kind of like an apostrophe or two apostrophes, or almost like 1/2 of quotation marks. So if I wanted to write 3 inches, I could write 3 inches out in words. I could write 3 in, or I could write 3 with the half quotation marks, you could say. For a foot, it might be ft, or it might be one line or like an apostrophe. So 4 feet, I could say 4 ft, or 4 with the one little dash or apostrophe. So it means the same thing. For yards, the abbreviation is yd, so 7 yards would be 7 yd. And for miles, you might think, well, miles is m. However, we usually use mi for miles, only because we don't want to get it confused with meters. And meters is commonly used with m. So again, just the different abbreviations, I'd say the key ones are the inches and feet, right? Understanding that the single dash or the single apostrophe and the double apostrophe can also represent units. And what's common or what's unique as well about the imperial system is that the imperial measurements can sometimes combine units together. So we could have measurements in feet and inches, right? Whereas in the metric system, usually it's only in one kind of unit. It'd be like 1.5 meters. We wouldn't say 1 meter, 50 centimeters, right? Or we wouldn't say 10 centimeters and 5 millimeters. We'd say 10.5 centimeters. But because the imperial system doesn't have that kind of common conversion between them, they tend to combine measurements. So we could say combine feet and inches. So 4 feet and 5 inches. You might say it as 4 feet and 5 inches, or commonly you see it as 4, the 1 apostrophe, and then 5 with the half quotations or the 2 apostrophes. You commonly see it as that. Inches alone, we might see it as 15 inches. Again, it might be 15 IN or 15 the apostrophe or double apostrophe. We might also see fractions. So 8 1/4 inches, say 8 1/4 inches, or again, 8 1/4 IN. And you might also see it as decimals, right? So 5 3/4 of an inch would be 5.75 inches. Or again, different abbreviations depending on what we prefer to use. But we could also turn those fractions into decimals as well. So understanding that 3/4 is the same as 3/4 or 0.75. So again, a little bit different from the metric system, different ways we can kind of write our units or even write multiple units together. So let's just kind of go through the table looking at converting the measurements as a fraction to measurements as a decimal. So 3 3/8 of inch. So if with a decimal, we're going to have our whole number. So we have 3 whole inches, so it's going to be 3 with a decimal, so 3 point something. And now to figure out what the decimal place is, we can divide the fraction, 3 divided by 8. Right? If we want, we can just kind of do it off to the side. So 3 divided by 8 equals 0.375. So that means my decimal is 3 from the whole number, and then the 0.375 from the fraction. 2.75 as a decimal, we want to convert that to a fraction. So we're going to have a whole number of 2. Now we need to represent 0.75 as a fraction. So you could say, well, 0.75, kind of the same thing as saying 75 over 100. We could reduce that to 3/4, or again, recognize that 0.75 represents 3/4. So we'd say 2 3/4 of an inch. Next part, 1 15/16 of an inch. So the 1 means we have a whole inch, so we have 1 as our whole number. We have our decimal, and we just need to figure out what that fraction converts to. So 15 divided by 16 converts to 0.9375. So as a decimal, we'd say we have 1.9375 inches. And then finally, 7.5 inches as a decimal, converting it to a measurement as a fraction. We still have 7 as our whole number. Now to represent 0.5 as a fraction, so 5 or 0.5 or 50, we could say 50 out of 100, which is the same thing as saying 1/2 or a half. So we could say 7 1/2 of an inch. So that would be kind of just showing how we can convert between measurements with fractions and measurements with decimals. Right? Decimals might be easier to work with when we're doing actual calculations, but we're going to see that as we read measurements in imperial measurements, we tend to use fractions. So in the metric system, centimeters are divided into millimeters, specifically 10 of them. So centimeters are divided into 10 millimeters. So when we're reading a ruler and we're looking at the metric system, there's 10 kind of even or equally spaced slashes or dashes in every centimeter. The imperial system is a little bit different. In the imperial system, the inches are divided in half, and then each half is then divided in half again, and so on and so on. And the smallest fraction we're going to be working with is 1/16. So it's not quite the same as the metric system. So you can't just read it as the same way or write it down as the same way because it is a little bit different. So to help with kind of reading an imperial ruler, right, we might see different size spacings. So the first one we have, a kind of a common one, so this is between 0 and 1 inch. So for example, how many spaces are there? There are 2 spaces. So in this case, each space is equal to a half, or this line is equal to 1/2 of an inch. In the next one, it's divided up into 4 equal spaces. So these lines would represent 1/4 of an inch. So 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. We also know that that middle one is the same as a half, right? So you are going to be using kind of equivalent fractions here. The next one, it's divided up into 8 equal spots. So each line in this case would represent 1/8. But we also know that 2/8 is the same as 1/4, 4/8 is the same as a half. So there's equivalent fractions again going on, like we said. And the last one is divided up into 16 equal spots or equal segments. So when we're counting from starting with the smallest line size, we're counting 16ths. Again, understanding equal or equivalent fractions. So 1/16, 2/16 or 1/8, 3/16, 4/16, or you might say 2/8 or 1/4. Right? So a lot of equivalent fractions in here. But the lowest that we're going to look at in our terms is 16ths. You could go further and go into 30 seconds. Some imperial rulers do go that small, but we're just going to stick with the smallest as being 16ths. So overall, let's kind of fill in the measurements. Let's look at the different measurements that we might see within an inch. And again, these measurements or markings would repeat. So after 0 to 1, we then go from 1 to 2 and have the same spacing as the same lines in the next segment, and then the next segment, and so on and so on. So again, the smallest lines represent a 16th of an inch. So this is 1/16. The next one would represent 2/16 or 1/8. Try to fit this all in here. So 1/16. Next one would be 2/16, which we could also convert to 1/8. We then have 3/16. We then have 4/16, which we can convert to 2/8, which is also the same as 1/4. We have 5/16. 6/16, which we can convert to 3/8. 7/16, 8/16, or 4/8, or 2/4, or 1/2. Right? So again, different ways we could count it or measure it. 9/16, 10/16, or 5/8, 11/16, 12/16, or you might say 6/8, or 3/4, 13/16, and again, we're kind of just repeating this pattern. 14/16, or 7/8, and then finally 15/16, and then we get to 1. So these measurements or these spacings are equal across the board, or not across the board, repeatable across the board. So we go 0 to 1, we have all these measurements. And then from 1 to 2 inches, we would have all these measurements in there again. So you do 1 and 1/16, or 1 and 2/16, or 1/8, and so on and so on. So if you're counting by starting with the smallest ones, you can count starting by 16ths. And then again, as you work up, just remember that there may be equivalent fractions like eighths and quarters and halves. So depending on where you are, if you're on a bigger line, chances are you probably have to find an equivalent fraction. Not that it's wrong, but again, the equivalent fraction makes it a little bit simpler. So rather than saying 2/16, I can say 1/8. Rather than saying 8/16 or 16ths or 4/8, I can say 1/2. So as an example, let's just kind of work through and go and write out the complete measurement above each arrow on the following imperial ruler. So starting with the first one, again, we can start by counting 16ths, right? 1/16, 2/16. So this is 2/16, but we can convert that to 1/8. Again, the next one, if we want to count by 16ths, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6/16. What we could also do is we can count by the second largest line. So we have 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, which also works out as well. We're down to looking at a small line, so we want to start counting with the smallest one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is 9/16. Now for the next one, we can jump right ahead. So we're already past 1 inch. So we're going to have 1 down no matter what. Now we're starting with the small line again. So this would be 1 and 1/16. The next one, again, we're beyond 1 inch. So we're going to start with a whole inch. We are dealing with the small line, so we have to count each individual one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's 1 inch and 7/16 of an inch. Moving on to the third one in this next segment. So again, we are starting with 1. If it helps, you can always start by counting each line individually. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that means 12/16. Understanding though, that because it's not a small line, right, this line here is not the smallest line, chances are we can find an equivalent fraction. The 1 is going to stay the same. You might say, well, if I'm looking at 18ths or 8ths, sorry, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6/8. I can still make that even smaller or reduce it. 1's going to stay the same. If I'm counting the next largest one, 1, 2, 3. So 1 3/4, which is the same thing. The next one, we're beyond 2 inches now. So this is going to be 2 inches. And what we could do, because we're dealing with this third largest line, we're dealing with quarters, right? So I could start counting, okay, is there any other line smaller than this? Nope. Okay, so this has to be 1/4. So I could say this is 2 and 1/4. We could also again work through each line. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 4/16. Recognizing that it's not the smallest line, so we should be able to have equivalent fractions. 4/16 is the same thing as saying 2/8, which we then convert to 2 1/4. The next one, it is looking at a small line, so that means we have to deal with the 16ths. So we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9/16. And you will notice that I'm not going beyond the 2. Right? Every time I get to a whole inch, I repeat the counting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? I'm not counting all the way back from 0 and counting the lines up. Right? Those kind of 1/16, 2/16, 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, they restart every time we pass an inch. Last one, Again, if I wanted to, I could write it out in sixteenths. So this would be 14/16, or again, equivalent fraction, 7/8. We are dealing with the second smallest line, so we should be dealing with eighths. Next one, again, we're dealing with small lines, so we're going to be dealing with sixteenths. So we've moved past 3 inches. So then we can just start counting 1, 2, 3 lines. So 3/16. The next one, again, it's not the smallest line, so we could kind of look at what size of the line we're dealing with. If it helps though, again, start all the way from the bottom, or all from the smallest one. So 3 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8/16. You might then reduce it to 3 and 4/8, or 3 and 2/4, or probably the easiest one, 3 and 1/2 of an inch. Right? It is the second largest line, so we are dealing with a half. And then lastly, again, you go through the same process, whatever you are comfortable with. We are past 3 inches though, so we are going to start with 3. It is the second or the third smallest line, so we are dealing with quarters. Right? But again, you could start with the sixteenths and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So 3 and 12/16. Or you could convert that to 3 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6/8, or 3 and 3/4. So either way you choose to do it is fine. However, it's easiest for you to count or to figure out the fractions. But I will say that you do want to have them in the most reduced fraction as possible, or the lowest terms possible, because it makes it easier to pronounce, and it makes it easier to work with when you're working through kind of these calculations. So again, the main thing from this lesson is just understanding what the imperial system is, what units we kind of measure it in, the abbreviations that we use those units with, and how to measure or read a ruler based off of the imperial side rather than the metric side.